Well, today, I'm incredibly pleased to introduce iMac, our consumer product.
And we are introducing a product today that takes us exactly there, and that product is called iPod.
And we are calling it iPhone.
It's called the MacBook Air, and we call it the iPad.
Time and time again, Apple has created some really revolutionary products. The original iPhone, MacBook Air, iPad, and the Apple Watch. All of these products, while not necessarily first in their class, have made a massive impact on the world of tech. And they have something else in common too. They all sucked. The iPhone was born out of frustration. Steve Jobs, like many at the time, hated the way phones were clumsy bricks with fixed buttons, tiny screens, and abysmal user interfaces. This frustration led Jobs to wonder if he could do it better, to bring the simplicity and convenience of the Mac to a phone. In January 2007, Apple announced what they had been working on for over 2 years at that point: the iPhone. This keynote presentation is widely regarded as the best tech product announcement ever.
Who wants a stylus?
Its layout, content, and cadence is simply masterful, as it should be, given that the keynote was meticulously rehearsed for months. While it's pretty undeniable that this event changed the world, it also nearly destroyed Apple. And that's because, quite frankly, iPhone was not ready. At the keynote, iPhone didn't even have a fully working keyboard. The display was plastic instead of glass, and it couldn't play a full song without crashing. All of this because, quite simply, nothing like that had ever been done before at Apple. They were trying something new and had to adapt to make it happen. The original iPhone was, in retrospect, a public beta test. Copy and paste, a front-facing camera, the ability to rearrange applications, taking video, changing the home screen wallpaper, having quick controls for brightness or Wi-Fi settings, turn-by-turn directions. These are all things the original iPhone on iPhone OS 1 couldn't do. Steve Jobs was convinced at the time that web apps developed with Web 2.0 and Ajax in Safari were the future for expandability, so the original iPhone shipped with 16 stock apps and no way to add more. In order to activate iPhone or put music on it, you had to connect it to a device running iTunes. It wasn't a standalone product. These things seem like major oversights today. How could you ship an iPhone without an app store? But this was a first attempt at a phone. The technological advancement came before the refinement. This wasn't the first time Apple used the public to test and refine a new product category. In fact, just 1 year after the iPhone was announced, Apple ambitiously released a radical new product category: the MacBook Air. Again, the Air was born out of frustration. In 2008, netbooks were sweeping the nation. Tiny, cheaply made laptops with microscopic screens, miniature keyboards, and weak Intel Atom processors. Netbooks were incredibly popular because they were a lot more portable than the large, heavy laptops almost every manufacturer was selling at the time, Apple included. Apple's then smallest MacBook was the 1-inch thick, 5-pound white plastic MacBook. Not exactly a lightweight. Again, Apple wanted to try the obvious but as yet unexplored: build a thin laptop that didn't compromise on weight, keyboard or screen size, or portability. A simple formula, but easier said than done. The main problem was that there was a reason laptops were thick in 2008. Intel's Merom series Core 2 Duos were built on a 65nm process with a pretty sizable chip package. It needed a large motherboard and pretty beefy cooling. So Apple got creative. They got Intel to build them a Core 2 Duo on a package just 60% of its normal size, and they built the smallest logic board ever fitted to a Mac at the time. This allowed the design team to build a laptop that was so small it fit, famously, in a manila envelope.
This is the new MacBook Air.
This radically thin design was famously thinner at its thickest point than competitors were at their thinnest. But the route Apple had taken to pull it off had more than a few compromises. Just a few months earlier, Steve Jobs had declared that Apple didn't ship junk.
We just can't ship junk. we don't offer stripped down, lousy products.
And yet, stripped down is exactly what Apple had to do to fit a Mac in this slim chassis. The first compromise was on ports. Jony Ive insisted that the entire device be tapered, including the sides, so they had to angle the MagSafe port at a very awkward degree underneath the device, and most annoyingly, the 3 ports it did have were under this weird trapdoor. Not only was that weird and annoying, it also meant that peripherals with thick housings wouldn't even fit in some cases. The compromises made on the inside were even more dramatic. A tiny fan paired with a tiny heatsink that barely cooled the CPU. This Core 2 Duo reaches its thermal limits absurdly fast, and when under any amount of sustained load, it actually throttles down to just one single core. It was painfully hot and painfully slow. To make matters even worse, the original MacBook Air started shipping just before SSDs were becoming mainstream. They were still really expensive at the time, but unfortunately Apple couldn't fit a normal 2.5-inch hard drive inside the MacBook Air. So they pulled the stock 80GB hard drive directly from an iPod. These things ran at 4200 RPM. They were absolutely painful. Straight out of the box, a brand new MacBook Air felt sluggish and ancient. It looked futuristic but behaved like a PowerPC Mac from years earlier. And yet, despite the clear drawbacks, the Air was not the budget Mac that it is today. Adjusted for inflation, it cost an eye-watering $2,142. What Apple was trying to do with the MacBook Air is reinvent the notebook. But they ended up missing the market completely with their bananas pricing. The Air was promising, but it evolved the category rather than reinvent it. It certainly didn't destroy the netbook because it was 4 times more expensive than they were anyway. 2 years later, however, Apple pretty succinctly set their sights on the netbook once and for all.
Everybody uses a laptop and or a smartphone. And the question has arisen lately, is there room for a third category of device in the middle? Some people have thought that that's a netbook. The problem is netbooks aren't better at anything. And we don't think that they're a third category device. But we think we've got something that is. And we call it the iPad.
The iPad was another example of Apple taking a different approach than the rest of the market. Instead of cheapening a laptop, they supersized an iPod Touch to make an entirely new experience. The netbook basically just took a laptop and made it worse and weird. The entire purpose of the iPad was to build a dedicated product that would fit in that category without feeling adapted. But the problem was, as with many first-generation products, it was. iOS was built for the iPhone, so it was basically scaled up to fit a larger screen. Apps, too, were initially scaled up to fit the iPad, so at first launch it didn't add as much functionality as Apple was hoping. The iPad itself was also quite limited. Nowadays we have perennial debates about whether an iPad can replace your laptop, and for some it already has. But in 2010, people weren't replacing anything with an iPad. In their review, the New York Times noted that if you've already got a laptop and a smartphone, who's going to carry around a third machine? One of the biggest drawbacks in the early days of the iPad was that developers hadn't yet had time to build their apps to take advantage of the larger screen, so most apps were in that weird mode where they would show up as a small iPhone-size app and then you would zoom it in and they would blow up on the screen. It was very strange for a premium $500 plus device. An interesting quirk about the iPad as well as the iPhone and MacBook Air was that Apple was very quick to shove it under the carpet and move on. The iPad 2 came out just 1 year later, was vastly superior, and the iPad 1 was almost immediately dropped from iOS support. It only runs iOS 5, whereas the iPhone 4 can run iOS 7 on the same A4 chip. The iPhone was also very quickly dropped. It can only run up to iPhone OS 3.1.3, just 2 major revisions newer than what it shipped with. The original MacBook Air can only run OS X Lion after shipping with Leopard. It also can't run OpenCL applications due to the Intel GMA X3100 graphics. It's crazy to look at these revolutionary devices and realize that they were all kicked out after just 2 years. They were also replaced after just 1 or 2 years with vastly superior updates. The iPhone 3G, iPad 2, and 2010 version of the MacBook Air were all hugely successful, much more so than their arguably more revolutionary but much more flawed predecessors. And these 3 devices are not the only examples of this. Almost every first-generation Apple product has some deep flaw. The original MacBook Pro had 5 revisions in the first few months of launch to deal with coil whine, faulty antennas, bad hinges, and popping speakers. The original Apple Watch was extremely slow even when it was brand new, and it was extremely limited as well because it ran apps on an iPhone, so it was completely tied to your phone. Another example, the 12-inch MacBook was supposed to be Apple's triumphant ultra-portable fanless laptop, but instead it belched out the butterfly keyboard that ruined our lives, was hideously slow, and it overheated like crazy. Time and time again with first-generation Apple products, we see these glaring faults. But you know what? I'm okay with it. Some say that Apple should hold off on announcing something until they are ready to release a fully featured product, but a lot of those people are the same folks that complain when Apple doesn't jump on whatever trend is popular that month. The thing is, as hard as it might be for some fanboys to admit, Apple is a company. They don't always know exactly what they're doing. First-generation products are developed without public input. They don't know what we want or what we would do differently before we get our hands on it en masse. And this is all really important to keep in mind right now because we are on the cusp of 2 major Apple transitions. The first is the transition away from Intel to Apple Silicon. This is something that we've been asking for and curious about for a while, but we don't yet know what's going to happen once we actually get our hands on these first-generation Apple Silicon devices. And the second big release is the presumably upcoming announcement of Apple Glass. Virtual reality, augmented reality, this is not something that Apple has really done, especially in the form of a wearable, so who knows what we actually want them to do? We don't know, they don't know. While we can't predict the future, there are lessons we can learn from the past. Apple doesn't admit that they make mistakes, but they absolutely do, and often their first version isn't their best. The smart move as a consumer is to get excited by the new and fresh, but commit to the refined and improved. Whatever happens over the next few years, we're in for a hell of a ride, but to think that the ride will be 100% smooth and seamless would be foolhardy. I mean, this is the same Apple that's reportedly thinking about not shipping a charger with the iPhone and that still hasn't put a calculator app on the iPad. They may be the largest tech company in the world, but they still make some very confusing and at times frustrating decisions with the way they update and release their products. So I, for one, am very excited to see what happens with the transition to Apple Silicon, as well as the upcoming Apple Glass. Now, that's not gonna be super immediate, probably not another year or 2 or 3. But I think it's important to note that we should keep an open mind without necessarily jumping on the first version of whatever product Apple releases. And yes, that can be annoying because we don't like to wait. If you're anything like me, and you probably are if you're subscribed, then you're kind of just itching for what's new and what's exciting, but that doesn't necessarily always mean that it's the best value. So that's gonna do it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this topic. Let me know what you think about the upcoming transition, as well as the products that we talked about in today's video. Let me know all of that stuff down in the comments below or over on Twitter at Luke Miani, and feel free to check out my subreddit, which you'll find linked in the description below. And with that, I will see you all in the next video.